The city buzzed with life as the evening sun cast long shadows over the busy streets. People hurried along the sidewalks, lost in their own worlds, the hum of traffic blending with the distant sound of street musicians. It was just another regular day, or at least it seemed that way at first. Amara walked with quiet confidence, her tall, muscular frame standing out among the crowd. She wasn't just strong in appearance. Her strength radiated from within. Years of discipline, training, and pushing past limits had built her into a force to be reckoned with. She was proud of who she was, and she never let anyone make her feel small. But not everyone saw it that way. A few blocks away, a group of men loitered near a convenience store, their laughter sharp and mean. They had been there for a while, looking for trouble or something to entertain themselves with. When Amara passed by, they immediately took notice. "Hey, look at this one," one of them snickered, nudging his friend. "Ain't she something? Built like a tank." Another one smirked, crossing his arms. "What's a woman like that trying to prove? You think lifting weights makes you a man?" His voice dripped with mockery, and the others chuckled. Amara heard them, of course she did, but she kept walking, choosing not to engage. She had encountered people like them before, small-minded, insecure, desperate for attention. She had nothing to prove to them. But they weren't done. "Hey, we're talking to you," one called out, stepping forward. "Don't be rude now." She stopped. Not because she felt threatened, far from it. She'd have handled worse. But there was something about the way they laughed, the way they fed off each other's cruelty, that made her pause. She turned slowly, meeting their eyes, her expression calm but unshaken. "I heard you," she said, her voice steady. "I just didn't think you were worth responding to." That should have been the end of it. But pride is a fragile thing, especially for men who build their worth by tearing others down. The group stiffened, their laughter fading into something colder. "You got a smart mouth," one of them muttered, stepping closer. "Think you're better than us?" Amara exhaled, already bored with the conversation. "I don't think about you at all." For a brief moment, there was silence. A heavy, charged silence. Then, like a switch flipping, one of them lunged, maybe to grab her arm, maybe to intimidate. Big mistake. Amara moved like lightning, her reflexes sharp and practiced. In an instant, she sidestepped, and before he knew what was happening, he found himself on the ground, gasping for breath. She hadn't even hit him, just used his own momentum against him. The others froze, their confidence faltering. Amara's eyes swept over them, unbothered. "Are we done here?" But some lessons are learned the hard way, and these men were about to regret everything. The man on the ground groaned, clutching his chest where he had landed hard. His friends hesitated, their bravado slipping for a brief moment as they looked at Amara with a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. They had expected her to be scared, to shrink under their taunts, to walk away with her head down. Instead, she had barely broken a sweat, and one of them was already on the ground. The street around them carried on as usual. A few people had turned their heads, but this was the kind of city where people minded their business. No one stepped in, no one interfered. The world kept moving, unaware of the quiet storm brewing between Amara and the group of men. One of them, taller than the rest with a deep scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. His name was Jake, and he was the kind of man who had spent his life making sure no one ever made him look weak. Right now, that image was crumbling fast. "You got lucky," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "You don't want to start something you can't finish." Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She had seen men like him before. They talked big, acted tough. But the second they met someone who wasn't afraid of them, their true nature showed. She could tell he wasn't just upset, he was humiliated. "I didn't start anything," she said, her voice even. "But you don't want me to finish it either." The other two men shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a younger guy with nervous energy, muttered, "Come on, man, let's just go." But Jake wasn't ready to back down. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of others. He turned to Amara, a slow smirk forming on his lips. "You think you're tough, huh? That's cute." Amara didn't move, didn't react. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the strongest response. It made people uneasy, made them question themselves. She let Jake stew in that silence for a moment, his smirk twitching at the edges. Then finally she said, "Walk away." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request. It was a statement, calm and certain. For a moment, it seemed like he might listen. His friends were already backing up, their bravado fading. But Jake couldn't let it go. His pride was too big, his temper too short. He glanced at the man still struggling to get up and clenched his fists. "You don't tell me what to do," he snapped. Then he lunged. It happened fast. Amara barely moved, sidestepping with ease as his swing cut through empty air. Before he could regain his footing, she shifted, planting her weight firmly before delivering a controlled shove to his shoulder. It wasn't even a full-force hit, but it sent him stumbling, his balance completely thrown off. He landed against the brick wall behind him, his breath escaping in a sharp exhale. The impact wasn't enough to hurt him, but it was enough to make it clear he was outmatched. This time, the street had noticed. A few people paused, whispering among themselves, their curiosity piqued. Foams weren't out yet, but it was only a matter of time. Jake saw it too, the way people were starting to look. He pushed himself off the wall, his face flushed with frustration. "You think this is over?" His voice was lower now, more controlled, but there was something dangerous beneath it. Amara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "That depends on you." For the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to do. If he backed down now, he'd look weak. But if he pushed further, he might end up making an even bigger fool of himself. His friends were watching. The street was watching. And worst of all, Amara was watching, completely unshaken. Finally, he muttered something under his breath, then jerked his head at his friends. "Let's go." Reluctantly, they followed, throwing a few lingering glares in Amara's direction. The man who had fallen earlier pushed himself up, wincing as he hurried after them. Within moments, they had disappeared around the corner. Amara let out a slow breath, rolling her shoulders. She didn't feel relief exactly, she had never been worried. But she knew this wasn't the end of it. People like Jake didn't let things go. And she had a feeling this was far from over. She turned back toward the direction she had been heading, her mind already shifting away from what had just happened. She had things to do, places to be. She wasn't going to waste her energy thinking about a group of insecure men with something to prove. But as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Across the street, half hidden behind a parked car, a figure stood still, eyes locked onto her. They had been there the whole time, observing, waiting. And unlike Jake and his friends, they weren't going anywhere. Amara didn't turn around, but she felt it, the weight of someone's gaze lingering too long. It wasn't like the usual passing stares she got for her physique or presence. This was different. It carried something heavier, something intentional. She kept her pace steady, resisting the urge to look over her shoulder. If there was one thing she had learned, it was that fear gave people power. The city streets started to thin out as she made her way toward her apartment. The day's light had faded into the deep blue of early evening, and the air had cooled. She could hear the distant sounds of cars, muffled conversations, the occasional siren. It was familiar, a background noise she had grown used to. But tonight it felt different, like the quiet carried something hidden beneath it. She turned onto a less crowded street, the lights dimmer here, casting long shadows on the pavement. Her senses stayed sharp. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Then, just as she was about to take the next turn, she caught it, a reflection in a store window. A figure, keeping their distance but following her path. Tall, broad shoulders, a hoodie pulled low over their face. Not one of Jake's guys, someone else. She didn't react, didn't change her stride. Instead, she let her mind work through the possibilities. A random stranger? A coincidence? Or was this connected to what had happened earlier? She took another turn, then another. Testing, seeing if they would follow. They did. Her jaw tightened slightly. Whoever they weren't just some passerby heading in the same direction. They were tracking her movements, staying just far enough behind that they probably thought she wouldn't notice. Amara exhaled slowly. She had two choices: keep walking, let them believe they had the upper hand, or turn around and end this now. She chose the latter. She stopped abruptly, spinning on her heel. The movement caught the figure off guard. They hesitated for half a second, as if debating whether to keep up the act. Then, instead of backing off, they did the opposite. They stepped forward. For the first time, Amara got a better look at them. A man, taller than she expected, but leaner. His hoodie cast a shadow over his face, but she caught the glint of something in his eyes. Not fear, not hesitation, just quiet calculation. "You're fast," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "Most people don't notice me that quickly." Amara crossed her arms, keeping her stance neutral but firm. "That's because most people aren't paying attention." He tilted his head slightly, like he was studying her. "Or maybe it's because you're different." She didn't react, didn't let him see if the words had any effect. Instead, she met his gaze, waiting. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips, like he found something about this situation entertaining. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to start something, just watching." "Watching what?" "You." The way he said it was casual, like it was the most normal thing in the world. But there was nothing normal about this. She stayed silent, letting him continue. "Jake and his guys," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction she had come from. "They were never gonna let that slide. You embarrassed them. And guys like that, they don't take embarrassment well." Amara already knew that. She had dealt with people like Jake before. But this man, whoever he was, wasn't one of them. He carried himself differently. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't trying to prove anything. That made him more unpredictable. "And you care because?" she asked. He shrugged. "I don't. Just figured you should know what's coming." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "And what exactly is coming?" The man's smile didn't fade, but there was something unreadable in his expression now. "You'll see soon enough." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like he had never been there at all. Amara stayed still for a moment, letting the weight of the interaction settle. He hadn't seemed like a threat, not in the way Jake and his crew had. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. She turned and resumed her walk home, her mind working through the conversation. She didn't know who he was, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. And whatever was coming next, she needed to be ready. Amara barely slept that night. She wasn't afraid, but her mind wouldn't let the events of the evening rest. The way Jake had looked at her before walking away, the way his pride had been wounded. She knew men like him didn't forget. But what lingered even more was the stranger, the one who had followed her, the one who had warned her. She didn't trust warnings from people she didn't know, especially not from people who watched her from the shadows. By morning, she was back in her routine, training, pushing her body past limits, strengthening not just her muscles but her mind. It was how she kept herself steady, how she prepared for anything. The gym was her space, a place where she didn't have to think about anything except her own progress. But even here, something felt off. A few times, she caught glimpses of unfamiliar faces, men she didn't recognize, lingering too long before disappearing. Was she imagining it? Was she being paranoid? She stepped outside, the crisp air cooling the sweat on her skin. The city was awake now, people rushing to work, cars honking in impatience. It should have felt normal, but something about today felt different. Then she saw them. Across the street, leaning against a parked car, was Jake. He wasn't alone. The two guys from last night were with him, but there were more now, 3 others she hadn't seen before. They weren't doing anything, just standing there watching her. Amara didn't stop walking. She wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of knowing they had her attention, but she was aware of them, her every step calculated. Then Jake pushed off the car and crossed the street. She could hear his footsteps behind her, unhurried but deliberate. His crew stayed back, but she knew they were close enough to jump in if things escalated. "Hey," he called out. She kept walking. "Come on now. Don't be like that," he said, his tone mockingly friendly. "We didn't get a proper introduction yesterday." She exhaled sharply through her nose, but still didn't stop. Jake chuckled. "You're making this difficult," he said, picking up his pace slightly. "See, I don't like feeling disrespected, and last night, that was real disrespectful." She finally stopped, turning slowly to face him. He was standing just a few feet away now, his smirk laced with something darker. His friends watched from across the street, waiting. "I didn't disrespect you," Amara said calmly. "You embarrassed yourself." His smirk twitched. For a second, she thought he might swing right then and there, but he held back, his jaw tightening. "You think you're tough," he muttered. "Think you can just walk around like you own this city, like you can talk to people however you want." "I think I don't have time for this," she replied, turning to walk away. That's when he moved. Not a punch, not a shove, just a grab, his hand latching onto her wrist. It was meant to stop her, to make her flinch, to show her that he was in control. But the second his fingers closed around her, Amara reacted. Her body moved on instinct. A sharp twist of her arm broke his grip, and before he could react, she stepped in, forcing him off balance. In one swift motion, she hooked her leg behind his and sent him stumbling backward. He caught himself before he hit the ground, but the damage was done. People nearby had stopped to watch, the same way they had the night before. Jake's face darkened. His crew shifted uneasily across the street. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he muttered. Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jake took a step back, breathing hard. Then he nodded slightly, like he had just made a decision. "All right," he said. "Have it your way." Then he turned and walked off. His crew followed. Amara stood still, watching them go. She knew what that meant. He wasn't done. He was just waiting. And whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be as simple as this. Amara watched as Jake and his crew disappeared down the street, their presence lingering in the air like a storm cloud that hadn't quite passed. She knew this wasn't over. The way he had looked at her, the way his voice had shifted from forced charm to something colder, he was planning something. And whatever it was, he wasn't going to come at her the same way twice. She rolled her shoulders, trying to shake off the tension as she resumed her walk. The city around her was alive, the hum of conversation, the honking of impatient drivers, the occasional laughter of someone lost in their own world. It was the kind of normalcy that made people think they were safe. But Amara knew better. She had learned long ago that the real dangers weren't always loud. Sometimes they were quiet, waiting just out of sight. That feeling of being watched returned, not just from Jake and his crew, but something else. A presence she couldn't shake. Her instincts were rarely wrong. She turned a corner and paused, pretending to adjust the strap of her bag as she glanced subtly at her reflection in a shop window. There, across the street, the same hooded figure from last night. Her pulse didn't quicken, but her muscles tensed. He was watching her again, just standing there, not bothering to hide the fact that he was tracking her movements. This wasn't a coincidence. Amara exhaled slowly and made a decision. Instead of continuing down the street, she turned abruptly and crossed the road straight toward him. The moment he realized she was coming, he shifted slightly, like he was debating whether to stay or slip away. But he held his ground. "All right," she said when she was close enough. "You've been watching me since last night. What do you want?" The man tilted his head slightly. Up close, she could see more of his features, sharp, angular, eyes that missed nothing. He didn't look like someone who followed people for fun. There was a precision to him, a calm confidence that set him apart from someone like Jake. "I told you already," he said. "Just watching." She narrowed her eyes. "And I told you I don't like being watched." He let out a small chuckle. "You're interesting." "That's not an answer." "No, but it's the truth." She crossed her arms. "Who are you?" For a moment, he didn't reply. Then finally he said, "Let's just say I know people like Jake, and I know what happens when they feel like they've been humiliated." Amara studied him carefully. "And you care because—" He shrugged. "I don't, but I like seeing people who think they're untouchable get knocked down a peg." Something about his tone made her uneasy. He wasn't warning her out of kindness. There was something else here, something she couldn't quite place. She glanced past him, scanning the street. "Are you alone?" A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Right now, yes." That answer didn't sit well with her. "I don't need your help," she said. "I never offered it." They stood in silence for a moment. The sounds of the city carried on around them, but between them, there was nothing but unspoken tension. Then finally he sighed. "Just be careful," he said. "Jake's not the kind of guy who lets things go." Amara already knew that. But before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd like he had never been there at all. She stood there for a moment, watching him go, her instincts telling her that whatever was happening was bigger than just Jake's bruised ego. Later that night, she kept her routine the same. She didn't want to change her patterns, didn't want to give the impression that she was rattled. If Jake or his people were watching, she wanted them to know she wasn't afraid. She trained harder than usual, pushing herself until her muscles burned, until sweat dripped from her skin. She needed to stay sharp, needed to be ready for whatever was coming next. By the time she left the gym, the streets had quieted. The air was thick with the scent of the city at night. Faint gasoline, the lingering aroma of street food, the distant buzz of neon signs. Then she felt it again. That presence. She didn't turn around, didn't let them know she had noticed. Instead, she took a detour, slipping down a quieter street, somewhere with fewer eyes. If they were following her, she was going to make them show themselves. Her footsteps echoed against the pavement as she walked, the silence around her growing heavier. Then, there it was, a second set of footsteps, just a beat behind hers. She waited until she reached the next alley, then, without hesitation, she moved. Fast. Turning sharply, pressing herself into the shadows. Whoever was behind her had expected her to keep going. When they stepped into view, she struck. A quick movement, her hand gripping the fabric of their hoodie, yanking them forward, spinning them off balance. In an instant, she had them pinned against the alley wall, her forearm pressing against their chest. It wasn't Jake. It was one of his crew, the younger one, the nervous-looking one from before. Up close, she could see the sweat on his forehead, the way his hands twitched at his sides. "What do you want?" she demanded. He swallowed hard. I wasn't." "Try again." His eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but she held firm. "Jake wanted me to follow you," he admitted quickly. "Said to see where you go, who you talk to." Amara's jaw tightened. "Why?" The guy hesitated. She pressed harder. "Why?" "He's planning something," he blurted. "I don't know what exactly, but he said he's not gonna let you make a fool out of him again." Amara took a slow breath, steadying herself. She had known this was coming. But hearing it confirmed just made her more certain. This wasn't just about a bruised ego anymore. She eased her grip just slightly. "And you?" His eyes flicked up to hers, uncertain. "What about me?" "You followed me. That means you had a choice. So are you with him? Or are you just scared?" He hesitated, and in that moment she saw it. Doubt. "I don't want trouble," he muttered. "Then stop running with people who bring it." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something else, but then he shook his head. "I gotta go." She stepped back, letting him go. He didn't waste a second, slipping away down the alley, vanishing into the night. Amara exhaled, her mind already working through what she had just learned. Jake wasn't done. He was planning something. And now it wasn't just a fight in the street. He wanted to make an example out of her. She wasn't going to let that happen. As she turned to head home, something else lingered in the back of her mind. The hooded stranger. The one who had warned her. Who was he really? And why did it feel like he was playing a part in all of this? Whatever was coming next, she had a feeling the real fight hadn't even begun yet. The city was restless that night. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. Amara could feel it in her bones, the way everything seemed quieter than usual, the way the streets felt just a little too empty. She'd have been watching her surroundings, listening to her instincts, waiting for the moment when Jake would make his move. And now she knew it was coming. She walked with purpose, keeping her pace steady, refusing to show any sign of hesitation. The last thing she would do was look afraid. She turned down a familiar street, heading toward home, but as soon as she stepped into the open stretch of road between buildings, she heard them. Footsteps, not just one or two, many. Then, from the shadows they emerged. Jake, his crew, and more. At least 7 this time. They fanned out slowly, cutting off the street behind her. Jake stood in the center, arms crossed, a grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Well, well," he said, voice dripping with satisfaction. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." Amara didn't react. She just met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "If I wanted to avoid you, you wouldn't have found me." Jake's grin twitched, but he kept his composure. He gestured lazily to the guys around him. "You made me look bad, Amara. You embarrassed me. And I can't let that slide." "Seems like you already did," she said. "Took you long enough to grow a backbone." A murmur rippled through the group. Jake's expression darkened. "You still think this is funny?" He took a step forward. "You think because you're tough, because you can fight, that you don't have to respect people like me." "People like you," Amara repeated, tilting her head slightly. "What, cowards? You don't get respect. You take it from people who are too scared to fight back." Jake's jaw clenched. He took another step closer, fists tightening. "Not so tough now, are you?" he muttered. Amara exhaled, slow and measured. Her muscles were loose, ready. "You think this is gonna go your way, Jake?" He smirked. "I know it is." Then he moved. It happened fast, faster than even she expected. Jake lunged, but she was already reacting, dodging to the side, her instincts sharper than ever. He swung, but she slipped under it, twisting his arm just enough to send him stumbling. Then the others jumped in. Fists, movement, chaos. Amara didn't hesitate. She fought with precision, blocking, striking, moving before they could pin her down. They weren't expecting this. They thought numbers would overwhelm her. But she had trained for this. She wasn't just strong, she was smart. She ducked under a swing, twisted another attacker's wrist, sending him sprawling. She landed a sharp elbow into the ribs of another, felt the air rush out of him. But there were too many. Even as she held her ground, she knew they were circling, looking for an opening. Then something unexpected happened. A blur of movement from the shadows. The hooded stranger. He came out of nowhere, striking fast. One of Jake's men went down before he even realized what hit him. Another tried to swing, but the stranger was quicker, dodging, countering with a strike that sent him reeling. Amara barely had time to register what was happening, but she didn't question it. She fought alongside him, the two of them moving in sync, taking down attackers one by one. Jake stumbled back, eyes wide with fury and disbelief. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't the moment he had planned. "Who the hell is this?" he snarled, glaring at the hooded man. The stranger didn't answer. He just took a slow step forward. Jake, for the first time, hesitated. Amara wiped the back of her hand across her jaw and exhaled. "Looks like your plan isn't working out." Jake's eyes darted between her and the stranger, calculating, trying to find a way out that didn't make him look weak. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, But then he turned. He ran. His crew followed, limping, clutching their bruises, disappearing into the night. The fight was over. Silence settled in the street. Amara turned to the stranger, still catching her breath. "You keep showing up," she said. "You gonna tell me why?" The man pulled down his hood slightly, revealing more of his face. There was something familiar about him. Not his features exactly, but the way he carried himself, the way he moved. "I told you," he said. "I know people like Jake, and I know what happens when they get too bold." She studied him, trying to piece it together. "You used to run with people like him, didn't you?" A flicker of something passed through his eyes. "A long time ago." She nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I make sure people like him don't get too comfortable." She let that sit for a moment. Then finally she extended a hand. "Amara." He looked at her hand, then shook it. "No." As they stood there, the city breathing around them, Amara realized something. This fight wasn't just about Jake. It never had been. It was about the kind of people who thought they could control others through fear. It was about standing against that. Jake might be gone for now, but there would always be more like him. And she would always be ready. Noah met her gaze. "You're not alone in this." She smirked slightly. "Good." Then together, they disappeared into the night, ready for whatever came next. Amara and Noah walked side by side through the quiet streets, the adrenaline from the fight still humming through their veins. The city had a way of returning to normal too quickly, as if nothing had happened, as if people like Jake didn't exist in the shadows, waiting for their next opportunity to prey on the weak. But tonight had been different. Jake had learned a lesson he wouldn't forget, and Amara had found something she hadn't expected, a silent ally in Noah. The street lights flickered as they moved, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Amara stole a glance at Noah, still trying to piece him together. He had appeared at just the right moment, fought with a kind of skill that wasn't learned overnight, and walked away without expecting anything in return. People like him didn't just appear out of nowhere. "You always show up right when things get messy," she said finally. Noah smirked slightly. "You have a way of attracting trouble." She exhaled a short laugh. "That's not an answer." He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked ahead, as if choosing his words carefully. "I used to be someone like Jake," he admitted. "Not exactly like him, but close enough. Ran with the wrong people, did things I regret." Amara didn't react, letting him continue. "One day, I pushed too far," he said. "Hurt someone I had no business hurting. And when it all came back on me, I realized I wasn't untouchable. I thought I had power, but I was just another pawn in a game I didn't even understand." He shook his head slightly. "So, I left. Started watching, learning. Making sure people like Jake don't get to feel invincible the way I once did." Amara studied him, recognizing the weight of his words. Regret had a way of shaping people, forcing them to pick a side. She had met plenty who let it consume them, but Noah had turned his past into something different. "So, what now?" she asked. He glanced at her, a small knowing look in his eyes. "That's up to you." She nodded slowly, understanding the unspoken offer. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He wasn't even looking to stick around. He had done his part, made sure she wasn't alone in that moment. But the fight, the choice of whether to keep standing up against people like Jake, that was hers to make. And she already knew her answer. She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "You're good at this," she said, "but you can't do it alone." Noah raised an eyebrow. "You asking me to stick around?" "I'm saying maybe this city could use a few more people willing to fight back." A flicker of something passed through his expression, surprise, maybe even approval. He had spent years watching, moving in and out of places like a ghost, never really letting himself belong. Maybe he hadn't expected someone to call him on it. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see what we can do." Amara felt something settle inside her. This wasn't about revenge, or proving a point, or making someone like Jake feel small. It was about making sure people like him didn't get to dictate who walked these streets in fear. As they continued down the road, the city stretched out before them, full of stories just like hers. People trying to survive, trying to stand their ground, trying not to get lost in the weight of the world. She wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd have to fight, but now she didn't have to do it alone. And that was enough. For now.